Hey everyone, I'm Belle Reid and welcome back to another video. So today I wanted to share some of my personal favorite tips and techniques for making weird sounds and doing experimental sound design using a Hydrasynth. Before we jump in, I want to mention that this is not a sponsored video. I've been helping out with some beta testing for ASM over the last little while, and through that process, I've discovered that there's a lot of really cool things you can do using a Hydrasynth that you can't do or that are quite tricky to do using other synths. So I wanted to package up some of my favorite ideas and techniques and share them with you today. So in this video, I'm going to be sharing 5 main ideas, and I'm going to show you a handful of different ways that you can implement them in your own patches. I'm going to talk about using audio feedback in the Mutant section on the Hydrasynth, using one-shot random modulation. We're going to take a look at using stepped LFOs to create sequences and patterns with a single key press, using envelope trig sources in conjunction with the LFOs, and finally, I will share a way that I like to creatively misuse the Unison mode on the Hydrasynth. I'm going to be demoing everything today using the new Hydrasynth Explorer, which I recently made a little video about as well, and I will share a link in the description of this video and also up here somewhere for you to check out if you're curious. But everything that I'm going to be sharing is going to work in exactly the same way on any of the Hydrasynths that you may be using. Okay, so with all of that said, let's get started. The first thing that I want to share with you today is using audio feedback from within the Mutant section on the Hydrasynth. Now, for those of you who are familiar with my music and what I like to do creatively, it shouldn't come as a surprise to you that I love working with feedback. I find it super interesting to work with because it automatically injects your music and the instrument that you're working with so much organic unpredictability. And I personally really find it inspiring when you start to create this kind of non-linear ecosystem with your sounds and with your instrument, where turning one knob or pressing one key, instead of doing what we might expect it to do, which is one thing, right? Change one parameter or play one new note, all of those relationships start to get blurred, and you may turn one knob and sweep through an entire series of new, rich, and complex sound worlds. Now, for the most part, when I'm working with feedback, I'm typically working with either a no-input mixer or a modular synth, both which make it quite easy for you to create different feedback loops inside of the instrument. In most self-contained synthesizers, you can't really do feedback internal to the synth engine in the same way that you can with a modular or a no-input setup. At best, you may have an audio input on the synth that you can patch the main audio outputs back into, and in that way you can explore some feedback possibilities. But chances are you're not going to be able to control it or push it very far. The Hydrasynth, on the other hand, actually has a few different points at which you can inject feedback into the signal path, namely in the Mutant section. And within there are a number of different ways that this feedback can be manipulated and explored. So let's take a look. All right, so there are essentially 3 different ways that we can induce feedback using the Mutant section here on the Hydrasynth. The first is feedback internal to each mutant. The second is feedback between mutants that are in series. And the third is feedback between mutants that occur in parallel. So we're going to take a look at examples of each of those one at a time. So let's start with feedback internal to each mutant. So first of all here, I've got my oscillator set to a simple sine wave to start. Now we'll open up the mutant menu and take a look at the options that we have available. So you'll notice here that in the mutant menu, there's an option here called feedback. And in a nutshell, what this feedback control here is going to do is it's going to allow us to introduce feedback from the mutant's own output back into its input. And exactly how this sounds is going to vary quite a bit depending on the mutant mode that you have selected, the various settings, the source of the modulation, and so on. So I definitely encourage you to explore here and play around a bit. All right, so here we have a basic sine tone. I'm in FM Lin, linear FM mode. I'm going to turn up the dry wet mix a little bit here. And let's introduce some feedback. Can adjust the depth as well. Awesome. So that sounds pretty interesting already, but where things start to get really cool, in my opinion, is when you adjust the modulation source. So right now we have this set to oscillator 1. I'm just going to scroll back a little bit in the menu and choose a sine wave as the modulation source. And now we also have access to this ratio control here. Which can get us into some really interesting territory. In particular, I find that things get really cool when you're working with pretty low ratios and also fairly low depths, but it's worth exploring the full range of these knobs because there's a lot of really interesting stuff that can happen. Cool, so that's just the FM Lin mode, and if you scroll through the mutant mode menu, you'll see that there are a ton of different options here to check out, and they're all going to sound really different from one another. So the next way that we can induce feedback here is between mutants that are in series. So in other words, between mutants 1 and 2 and between mutants 3 and 4. So the only way that this particular method works is if you have one of your mutants set to FM Lin mode. And that's because you are able to then select the other mutant as your modulation source. So here I have my same simple sine wave as my oscillator, and I've set it up so that the source for mutant 1 is mutant 2. Okay, so to start, I'm going to keep things really simple, and I'm not going to turn up the internal feedback on Mutant 1. All I'm doing is selecting Mutant 2 as the modulation source for Mutant 1. And then over here on Mutant 2, I'm currently in wave stack mode. But what's cool about this is you can choose any mutant mode you want. And basically what you're doing is inserting that mutant into this feedback loop that we have here. So I'm going to go back over here and turn up the dry wet mix. So this sounds crazy and really cool right out of the gates. And again, I haven't even turned up the internal feedback. You can experiment with adding some of that in as well. And of course, you can play around with different depth amounts. And in Mutant 2, you can also experiment with different mutant modes and depths, and all of that's going to have a huge impact. Here are a couple other quick examples of this feedback in series. All right, so the third way that you can explore feedback here in this mutant section is by working with the mutants in parallel. So instead of choosing a mutant as the modulation source that is related to the oscillator that you're working with, we can instead choose a mutant that is related to oscillator 2. Something that I really like to do is to cross-modulate the mutants. So for example, in this patch here, I still have a basic sine wave here on oscillator 1. My mutant 1 is in FM Lin mode, and I have mutant 3 as the source for the modulation. Then my mutant 3 down here is also set up in FM Lin mode, and I am using mutant 1 as the source for its modulation. So these two mutants are cross-modulating one another. And once again here, just like with our other examples, adjusting the depth on either of these two mutants is going to have a really big impact on the way that things sound. So you can get really creative with the various ways that you cross-modulate these mutants, especially when you start to add in both the mutants that are in parallel and in series with one another. So for example, in this patch, I have mutant 1 in FM Lin mode, and I'm using mutant 4 as its modulation source. Then mutant 3 is in FM Lin mode, and here I'm using mutant 2 as the source for its modulation. And now, just as we looked at before, these mutants can be any mode that you want, and there's a ton of variation there. So for now, I have mutant 2 set to PW original and mutant 4 set to phase diff. All right, so the next 4 things that I want to share with you are all going to build on one another sequentially. So first, let's start with one-shot random modulation. So there's a cool thing you can do with the LFOs on the Hydrasynth where you can set them to be in one-shot mode. And when you do this and you have trig sync set to either poly or single, each time you press a key, the LFO is going to complete its cycle once and then stop, unlike what you would expect with a typical LFO where it will cycle over and over and over again continuously. Something that I really love to do with this is to set an LFO shape to sample and hold. And then in one-shot mode, that means that every time you press a new key, you're going to generate a new static random value. So that means that you can then randomize any modulatable parameter of your sound or your patch with each new key press. All right, so let's take a look at a quick example using a random LFO to trigger a random wave shape every time we press a new key. Okay, so in this patch, I have my oscillator 1 set up in wave scan mode. I've selected a bunch of different waveforms for the bank here. And now I have my LFO 1 here, and I'm setting it up as sample and hold. I'm just going to page down here and make sure that my trig sync is set to poly right here. So poly, and then finally I'm going to turn one shot on. So with this setup, every time I press a key, I'm going to get a new random value generated from this LFO. So now here in the mod matrix, I am using a unipolar version of this random voltage from LFO1, and I have assigned that to the wave scan parameter of my first oscillator. So one of the things that's really fun to do is that every voice we have here has 5 LFOs, right? So we could actually set them all up to produce 5 completely different random values with each key press, and then we could use those to modulate many, many different parameters of our sound. So here's an example of another FM patch, kind of like what we were looking at before, but with this one, I am randomizing multiple different aspects of both the FM mutant and the filters, as well as the rate of some of the LFOs. So there's a lot of modulation going on here, a lot of different random values that are all being produced with each key press. Let's take a listen to this. Now remember, you can use these random values for any modulatable aspect of the sound. So there's definitely a ton to explore here. Something I've heard folks say is a drawback when it comes to the Hydrasynth is the fact that there's no built-in sequencer. So the next technique that I want to share with you has to do with using a stepped LFO to create sequenced patterns with a single key press. Now, of course, this isn't going to be exactly the same as working with a typical sequencer, but it does allow you to create sequenced modulation that you can use for any parameter of the sound that you're working with, which is pretty cool. So inside the Hydrasynth, if we click on our LFO, we've got a whole bunch of different options, right? We've got all of our standard LFO shapes, and then in addition to that, we have this really cool option, which is here referred to as step or step LFO. So the stepped LFO allows you to create your own LFO shape that is up to 64 steps long. So I'm going to page down here until I see step edit. And now we have access to all of these different steps, and we can draw in our different steps. Oops, there we go. Like so, and you can see here on the screen that we are seeing our steps appear as we draw them in, like that. So one thing to note about the stepped LFO is there's a couple different modes here. When you have semi-lock turned on, like so, and you edit your steps, you're going to be working with semitone deviations up or down from the bass note that you play on the keyboard. Otherwise, if you leave semi-lock off, you can still, of course, create your own stepped LFO shape. However, it's going to be slightly harder to get to precise quantized pitches. Okay, so for this patch, I have semi-lock turned on. I have set up a stepped LFO shape. Now in the mod matrix, I am going to route this LFO1, that's my stepped LFO, to the pitch of my primary oscillator here, and I'm turning the modulation depth all the way up. I'm also using the same LFO that's controlling the oscillator's pitch in order to determine its panning, so you can hear it moving across the stereo field a little bit. Awesome. Now, of course, we have a bunch of oscillators and a bunch of LFOs, right? So why not do this 2 or even 3 times? So I have this set up here in the mixer. I've basically just gone ahead and duplicated this same process with slightly different parameters for my different stepped LFOs. So I'm going to go ahead and turn up oscillator 2 now so we can hear it as well. I'll turn up oscillator 3. The fourth technique that I want to share with you today has to do with envelope trigger sources. So in most self-contained synths, the only way that you can trigger an envelope is by a key press or by using an arpeggiator or a sequencer and so on. Being that I come from a background of primarily using modular synthesizers, I've gotten pretty used to being able to trigger an envelope from pretty much any trigger source. And so I'll admit that this aspect of working with self-contained and poly synths has always been a little bit frustrating and confusing for me. On the Hydrasynth, there's this concept, however, of something that's called a envelope trigger source. So this basically means that with each of your envelopes, you can select up to 4 different trigger sources for the envelope. These could be things like key presses, external modulation inputs, a sustain pedal, the ribbon controller on the Hydrasynth keyboard or Hydrasynth Deluxe, or any of the built-in LFOs. So in my opinion, that's pretty awesome because it essentially allows you to decouple the envelopes from the playing interface of the instrument, allowing it to act a little bit more like a modular system. All right, so here's a simple patch to explore this concept. So my first oscillator is set to a sine wave. My filter here is set to a low pass gate. I have turned up the influence of envelope 1 on the filter. And for that envelope, I have just dialed in a short little plucky attack decay envelope with no sustain and no release. And I added a little bit of reverb in because why not? So here we have our little plucky articulation. Now, if we go onto the envelope page here and we page down a little bit, we will eventually come to something that says trig source. Here we go. So these are the 4 different trigger sources that we can use to trigger this envelope. So here you'll see on trig source 1, I have set it to LFO 1. So what this means is that if I press a key down, it's going to trigger the envelope as I press the key for the first time. And then if I hold the key down, it's going to re-trigger the envelope every time this LFO completes a cycle. So now where my mind immediately goes with a patch like this is how cool would it be to modulate the speed of this LFO? So here in the mod matrix, I'm going to set that up. I have selected poly aftertouch as my modulation source. I'm routing that to the rate of LFO1. I've also mapped the poly aftertouch to control a couple of other parameters here just for fun. So the more that I press in, it is going to lessen the impact of the envelope on our filter. So the sound is going to kind of fade away the faster it gets. And I've also done a little bit of modulation on the oscillator's pitch as well. So it creates this kind of nice bouncy ball feel, like a little marble or a bouncy ball that's dropping on the ground and then kind of rolling away from us. Something else that's pretty cool here is when we're using a stepped LFO, like we just looked at earlier, as our envelope trigger, it actually is going to re-trigger the envelope with each new step in the LFO rather than only re-triggering once the entire LFO shape has completed a cycle. So this was a particularly delightful discovery because it means that if you're using the stepped LFO to generate melodies or sequences like we were in the earlier patch, you can add a distinct articulation into each note of your melody. So here is the same patch that we were listening to before with the 3 sequences that we're layering together, but I've added in this idea of using the envelope trig source here, and I have LFO1, the stepped LFO, triggering our envelope. So now you can hear that we have a distinct articulation on the front of each one of those notes in our sequence. With that nice, short, plucky articulation, we can bring in voice 2 and voice 3. And then from here, we can play these envelope shapes a little bit, which can be really interesting as well. Okay, so far these examples that we've looked at with the stepped LFO and the envelope triggering have all been fairly melodic, but of course you can use this technique with non-melodic stuff as well. One of my favorite sound design tricks on the Hydrasynth involves a creative misuse of the Unison mode. And as a little bonus, this technique that I'm going to show you is also going to incorporate everything else that we've talked about so far in this video. Now, most polysynths have a unison mode, and the basic idea behind it is that it uses all of a polyphonic synthesizer's voices in order to play the same note or the same thing. And there's often an option to slightly detune all of the voices from one another in order to create a really big, rich sounding monophonic synth sound. One of the things that's super fun about working with a Hydrasynth, however, is that, as we've seen, a single key press, if you have your modulation sources set up correctly, can do a whole lot more than produce a single note. You can use a single key press to generate random values, making each one of your key presses sound completely different than the one that preceded it. Or you can use a single key press to initiate an entire sequence of events or a whole new pattern. So something that's super cool about the way that this instrument is set up is that when you have an LFO in the sample and hold shape in one-shot random mode, and you are using unison mode on the Hydrasynth, it's actually going to generate an entirely different random value for each of the voices that you are using in unison mode. So in other words, instead of generating one random sound every time you press a new key, you're actually able to generate up to 8 simultaneous different random sounds with each key press. Okay, so in this patch here, I have just a simple sine wave. I'm gonna go over into the voice menu here, and in polyphony, the polyphony menu, I'm gonna scroll until I go and find unison. For now, I'm going to turn the detune down to 0. I'll turn the density up to 8. I'm going to set my first LFO up to be the random values coming from the sample and hold. And I'm going to set it to be one-shot mode on, like we've looked at before. And now I'm going to assign this LFO to modulate the frequency of oscillator 1. Okay, so if we were working just with this one-shot random LFO and we weren't using unison mode, every time I pressed a key, we would get a new pitch, right? A new random pitch. But now, since I have unison mode turned on and I've turned up the density to 8, we are going to get 8 new random values every time I press a single key. Let's take a listen. And then this modulation depth control here gives me a bit of a control over the spread of that randomness. And there we go. Pretty cool. So let's take a look at another quick example of this. So here I have a stepped LFO that I have used to create a melodic sequence. That sequence is controlling the pitch of my oscillator. I have a random sample and hold LFO in one-shot mode, and I'm using that to control the speed of this sequence. Now in the voice menu, I have Unison mode turned on here, and I have a density of 8. So that means that every time I press a new key, we're going to hear 8 copies of the sequence that I've created, and they're all going to be played back at different speeds. I'm also randomizing the global envelope shape for each of these voices. So as you can hear, even though I've let go of the keys, they're fading out and they're going to swell in and swell out independently of one another, which is really nice because it kind of creates a varying density overall in the voices. I'm going to share a couple of other patches here with you that use, in some combination, all of the various techniques that we've talked about so far today. All right, so I hope you found these techniques helpful. All of the patches that we've looked at today in this video are available for download on my Patreon page for everyone who's at the member tier. So if you're interested in trying these out for yourself, you can head over there. I'll leave a link in the description of this video, and you can download them and check them out. And just a reminder that these patches will work on any of the Hydrasynth models. So even though I was demoing here on the Explorer, you can download them and load them into any Hydrasynth that you're using, and they should run with no problem at all. So to wrap things up here, we've looked at a lot of techniques. And of course, there are still about 1 million different things that you can do with these instruments. These are just a small sampling of some of the quirky and fun things that I have really been getting a lot of creative mileage out of recently. If you are interested in picking up a Hydrasynth of your own, there are some affiliate links in the description of this video, and anything that you buy using those links will help to support support this channel and make it possible for me to continue making more videos like this one. And finally, if you have any cool tricks that you've stumbled across on the Hydrasynth, let me know in the comments below this video. I love this instrument and I would love to continue to learn more about how it works and discover how other folks are using it as well. So that's it for today. As always, thank you so much for watching and listening, and I will see you next time.